There is a kind of man who wakes up every morning and immediately begins to negotiate with the world. Before his feet touch the floor, before he has drawn a full breath, before the light of the day has found the corners of his room, he is already calculating what must he do today to keep others comfortable, what must he swallow to avoid conflict, what version of himself must he present so that the world around him does not grow cold. He does not think of this as weakness. He calls it wisdom. He calls it maturity. He tells himself that people who make fewer waves live longer, sleep better, and earn the quiet reward of being liked by nearly everyone they meet. He has built his entire life on this philosophy, and, for a long while, it appears to work. People smile at him. They include him. They say he is easy to be around. And he takes this as evidence that he has chosen correctly, that his way is the right way, that the softness he has cultivated inside himself is not a flaw but a virtue. But, somewhere beneath that softness, something true is being buried alive. This is the story of what it means to find that buried thing, drag it into the light, and choose it completely, irrevocably, and, without apology, over every comfortable habit of self-erasure that a man has spent years perfecting. It is not a simple story. It does not move in a straight line. It does not reward the reader with easy victories or clean resolutions. What it offers instead is something rarer, an honest account of what a human being must go through in order to stop living as a version of himself that was designed for everyone else's comfort, and to begin living as the version that was designed for his own becoming. The world does not prepare men for this. Not really. Culture teaches men a particular brand of strength, visible, loud, physical, dominant, and leaves the interior world largely unexplored. A man is taught to lift heavy things but not to carry his own truth. He is taught to protect others but not to protect the core of his own dignity. He is taught to provide, to endure, to persist, but almost never is he taught to look at himself honestly and ask the hardest question a person can ask: who am I when no one is watching, and do I respect that person? That question is the beginning of everything. It is the seed from which self-respect grows, and self-respect, real self-respect, not the performance of confidence but the quiet, immovable conviction that you are worth your own loyalty, is the foundation upon which every meaningful relationship, every real connection, every lasting love must eventually be built. The right person, the right friendship, the right life, none of these things can find a man who has not first made himself a place worth arriving at. The weak self is not a stranger. It is not some foreign invader that crept into a man's life uninvited. The weak self was built carefully, brick by brick, over years of experience, usually beginning in childhood, where the lessons learned about love and acceptance were tangled up with conditions. A child learns early whether love in his household is freely given or quietly earned. If he learns that warmth comes when he is quiet, when he is agreeable, when he does not ask for too much, when he performs according to expectations, then he begins to build himself around that lesson. He begins to shape his personality not from the inside out but from the outside in. He becomes, in the truest sense of the word, reactive. His sense of self is not generated internally but is instead a mirror of whatever the people around him need him to be. By the time this child becomes a man, the architecture of the weak self is so deeply embedded that he cannot see it clearly. It does not feel like weakness. It feels like personality. It feels like who he is. He does not realize that his tendency to apologize for things that are not his fault is a learned behavior rooted in the childhood terror of disapproval. He does not recognize that his habit of agreeing with people he privately disagrees with is not open-mindedness but fear wearing the costume of flexibility. He does not understand that his inability to ask for what he wants in relationships, in work, in life is not humility but a deep and painful conviction that what he wants does not matter enough to be spoken aloud. These patterns follow him everywhere. They follow him into his friendships, where he gives more than he receives and tells himself this makes him a good person. They follow him into his work, where he accepts less than he deserves and frames this as loyalty or patience. They follow him into his romantic relationships, where he tolerates behavior that diminishes him, because somewhere in the architecture of his weak self is the belief, old, stubborn, and mostly unconscious, that love must be earned through sufferance, that the price of being close to another person is the willingness to make yourself smaller whenever the situation demands it. And then, one day, without any theatrical announcement, something shifts. It does not always arrive as a crisis. Sometimes it comes quietly, as a moment of sudden, sickening clarity in the middle of an ordinary afternoon. A man is sitting across from someone he has tried for years to please, and he watches himself in the act of contorting his words to avoid offending them, and, for the first time he sees it with a kind of cold precision. He has no idea what he actually thinks about this conversation, because he processed his own opinion through the filter of what this other person wanted to hear before he even had a chance to feel it. The thought is there for only a second before the habit closes back over it. But the second was enough. Something has been seen. And what has been seen cannot be entirely unseen. This is where the real story begins. Not in the grand moment of transformation, but in the small, almost invisible instant when a man becomes aware of the mechanism that has been running his life. That awareness is the first act of self-respect, not a roar but a whisper. Not a declaration but a question: what if I stopped doing this? The answer to that question is complicated, and it arrives over time rather than all at once. Stopping the patterns of the weak self is not like flipping a switch. It is more like learning to walk differently after years of compensating for an old injury. The muscles that were built around the old way of moving are strong and familiar, and every time a man tries to move in a new direction, they pull him back toward the posture he has always known. This is why so many people begin the journey towards self-respect and then abandon it, not because they lack the desire but because the discomfort of the transition is far more intense than they anticipated. The discomfort has a specific texture. It is the discomfort of disappointing people. When a man who has spent his life arranging himself around others' expectations begins to stop doing that, when he says no for the first time without a lengthy justification, when he disagrees out loud rather than nodding along, when he asks for what he wants instead of pretending he doesn't want anything, the people around him respond. Not always warmly. Not always with understanding. Some of them push back. Some of them grow cold. Some of them tell him, directly or indirectly, that this new version of him is less pleasant, less accommodating, less easy to be around, and, therefore, less desirable. And this is the crucible. This is the moment that determines whether the journey continues or collapses. Because the weak self, hearing this response, immediately moves to interpret it as evidence that the old way was correct. You see, it says, this is what happens when you stop being agreeable. People leave. People disapprove. People find you difficult. The cost of being yourself is too high. Go back. Shrink. Apologize. Return to the shape that everyone found comfortable. The man who cannot withstand this pressure goes back. He reabsorbs himself into the old patterns, perhaps with a new layer of shame layered over them, because now he has seen clearly what he is doing and he is doing it anyway. This is one of the more painful positions a person can occupy, knowing that you are diminishing yourself and continuing to do so because the alternative feels too dangerous. But the man who can hold his ground in that moment, who can feel the discomfort of others' disapproval and remain present with himself rather than rushing to soothe it, this man has done something extraordinary. He has chosen himself. Not selfishly, not cruelly, not without regard for others, but fundamentally, undeniably, he has made the choice that every act of true self-respect requires. He has decided that his inner truth is worth protecting even when the cost of protecting it is discomfort, friction, and the temporary withdrawal of approval. That choice does not make life easier immediately. In many ways, it makes life harder in the short term. But it does something that no amount of accommodation and self-erasure can accomplish: it makes a man real. And only real things can form real connections. Only a man who is genuinely present, whose words match his inner state, whose actions reflect his actual values, whose boundaries arise from authentic self-knowledge rather than fear, can attract and sustain the kind of relationships that actually nourish him. You cannot build something lasting on a foundation of performance. You cannot be truly known by someone if the person they know is a construction designed to please them. Love that reaches only the performance never touches the man inside it. This is the great paradox at the center of self-respect. The more fully a man becomes himself, the more clearly he expresses his actual nature, his actual limits, his actual desires, the more capable he becomes of genuine connection. And the right people, the ones who are themselves real and honest and unafraid, are drawn not to the performance but to the reality. They find the man who knows himself and holds himself in genuine regard to be not difficult but magnetic. Not cold but clear. not selfish but trustworthy because you always know where he stands. There is a silence that a man learns to carry when he has begun to destroy his weak self. It is not the silence of emptiness. It is the silence of someone who no longer needs to fill every moment with reassurance seeking, with noise designed to keep others comfortable with his presence, with the constant low hum of managing how he is perceived. It is the silence of a person who has decided that his own company is not a problem to be solved. This might sound like a small thing. It is not. The inability to be alone with oneself, truly alone, without distraction, without the constant turning outward toward others for definition and validation, is at the root of almost every pattern associated with the weak self. The man who cannot sit with himself will fill that solitude with anything available: other people's opinions, other people's needs, other people's crises, other people's definitions of who he should be. He becomes extraordinarily skilled at reading the room and extremely poor at reading himself. He knows, with a kind of social precision, exactly what everyone around him is feeling and needing at any given moment. He has almost no idea what he himself is feeling, because he has not practiced that particular form of attention. Learning to sit with oneself is an act of courage that culture rarely names as such. It is marketed, instead, as something vaguely sad, as loneliness, as isolation, as the resort of those who cannot manage to sustain human connection. But this misrepresents the thing entirely. The man who is learning to be alone with himself is not retreating from the world. He is, for perhaps the first time, actually encountering it, because he is bringing himself to the encounter rather than a mirror that reflects back whatever the world projects onto it. In this solitude, things become clear that were previously obscured by the noise of constant social management. A man begins to notice what he actually enjoys, not what he has been told he should enjoy, not what the people around him enjoy and, therefore, what he has mimicked enjoying, but what genuinely lights something up inside him when no one is watching. He begins to notice what he actually believes, not the positions he has adopted for social safety, not the opinions he has borrowed from people whose approval he craved, but the views that arise naturally from his own observation and experience of the world. He begins to notice what he actually wants from his work, from his relationships, from the days of his life as they pass through his hands, and this noticing, simple as it sounds, is a radical act for someone who has spent years treating his own desires as less important than everyone else's. This is the interior work of self-respect. It is unglamorous. It does not make for compelling content. There is no visible moment of triumph, no montage of progress, no audience to witness the shift. It happens in quiet rooms and, on long walks and, in the middle of the night when sleep won't come and, a man finds himself face to face with the parts of himself he has been avoiding. It happens in the moment of a difficult conversation when he speaks his true thought instead of the safe thought and feels the strange, almost physical sensation of being honest. It happens in the thousand small moments of daily life when the old habit arises, the impulse to apologize, to defer, to make himself smaller, and he pauses, and he chooses differently. Each of these moments is a small act of self-construction. And they accumulate. Over time, the man who practices them begins to notice that he feels different, not louder or more aggressive or harder in the way that weak conceptions of strength suggest, but quieter in a new way. Calmer. More settled. Less reactive to others' moods and opinions, not because he has stopped caring about people but because his sense of his own worth is no longer entirely dependent on their moment-to-moment responses to him. He has developed what might be called interiority, a center of gravity inside himself that holds him in place even when the world around him shifts. A man with genuine self-respect occupies space differently. This is observable, it is not mystical or imagined. The way he enters a room is different. Not because he has learned some technique of body language or practiced the performance of confidence, but because he is not managing anything. He is simply present. He is not scanning the room for signals about whether he is welcome, not adjusting his posture and expression to match what he believes will be best received, not editing himself in real time to minimize the risk of judgment. He walks in as he is, and this simple fact, the fact of a person who has arrived as themselves rather than as a carefully managed presentation, registers in the people around him in ways they often cannot articulate but unmistakably feel. People trust this kind of presence. Not because it is imposing or dominant, but because it is honest. There is no gap between the person and the presentation, and human beings are remarkably sensitive to that gap. We can sense, even without conscious analysis, when someone is performing, when the warmth is calculated, when the confidence is borrowed, when the ease is manufactured. And we can equally sense when a person is simply, genuinely there. When they mean what they say. When they are not angling for anything. When their self-possession is not a strategy but a fact. This presence does not demand admiration or seek approval. It does not need to. And this is precisely what makes it attractive in the deepest sense, not visually or superficially attractive, but attractive in the way that solid ground is attractive to someone who has been standing on uncertain footing. People are drawn to those who seem to know who they are, because so few people genuinely do. Most of us spend our lives performing versions of ourselves for different audiences, shifting shape according to context, never quite landing in a stable sense of our own identity. To encounter someone who has done that work, who has sat with himself long enough to know what he thinks, what he values, what he will and will not do, is to encounter something rare. And, in the domain of romantic relationships specifically, this matters enormously. The man who does not respect himself enters relationships from a position of need, not the natural, healthy human need for connection and intimacy, but a desperate, anxious need for external validation that he has not been able to generate internally. He needs the relationship to prove that he is worthy. He needs his partner's approval to feel okay about himself. And this need, however understandable its origins, creates a terrible dynamic because it places the other person in an impossible position, burdening them with the responsibility of providing a self-worth that must ultimately be self-generated, and it places the man in a position of chronic vulnerability, where any shift in his partner's mood or attention becomes a crisis, because he has no stable interior ground to stand on when the external validation fluctuates. The man who respects himself enters the same domain entirely differently. He is not looking for someone to prove his worth. He already knows his worth, not with arrogance, not with the puffed-up certainty of someone who has confused ego with self-respect, but with the quiet confidence of a person who has done honest inventory of himself, accepted both what is strong and what needs work, and decided that he is, on balance, someone worth being. He enters a relationship as an invitation rather than a plea. He offers something, his genuine presence, his honest engagement, his actual self, and he is curious whether the other person is someone he wants to share his life with, not just whether the other person will accept him. This reversal is subtle, but it changes everything. It changes the questions he asks. It changes the pace at which he moves. It changes what he is willing to accept and what he is not, because when your sense of worth is not contingent on the relationship, you are free to end it if it is wrong for you, and this freedom, paradoxically, makes the relationship safer for both people. A man who will leave if things become consistently wrong is a man who is genuinely present when he chooses to stay. The destruction of the weak self is not a single event. It is not the moment a man finally loses his temper with someone who has been taking advantage of him, not the dramatic confrontation or the tearful admission or the grand gesture of self-assertion. All of these can be part of it, but none of them constitute it. The destruction of the weak self is a sustained, daily, often invisible practice of choosing differently, of interrupting the old pattern before it completes itself, of speaking the true word instead of the safe word, of holding the boundary even when everything in the old conditioning screams to release it. There will be failures. There will be days when the old self reasserts itself so completely that a man can barely distinguish it from the new. He will agree to something he should not have agreed to. He will apologize for something that was not his fault. He will contort his words to avoid a conflict that he should have engaged directly. And, when this happens, the temptation is to treat it as evidence that the whole project is impossible, that the weak self is too deeply rooted to be removed, that change of this kind is not available to him, that he should simply accept what he is and stop torturing himself with the aspiration of something better. This is the weak self's last and most sophisticated defense, the argument that it cannot be defeated, delivered in the voice of self-awareness. It is not the voice that says you are fine as you are, don't change. It is the more insidious voice that says you tried to change and you failed, which proves that you cannot change, which means you should stop trying. This voice must be recognized and refused. Failure in the process of transformation is not evidence that transformation is impossible. It is simply evidence that transformation is a process, nonlinear, imperfect, sometimes maddeningly slow, but real. The man who keeps going after the failure, who does not collapse into shame or self-condemnation but simply notes what happened, understands it, and returns to the practice, this man is already demonstrating the thing he is building. Because self-respect includes the respect of the self in failure. It includes the willingness to extend to oneself the same grace and understanding that one would offer to someone they genuinely loved. A man who has been raised to earn love through performance often struggles deeply with this. Grace, for him, feels like an indulgence, like something that must be withheld in order to maintain standards. But the opposite is true. It is grace that makes sustained effort possible. Shame, by contrast, tends to produce paralysis, a man so afraid of encountering his own failures that he stops trying anything that might produce one. The man who gives himself honest grace, who can look at his failures without amplifying them into evidence of fundamental unworthiness, who can acknowledge his weaknesses without allowing them to define him, this man is building something unassailable. Because when your self-worth is not contingent on your perfect performance, other people cannot use your imperfection to diminish you. They can point to your failures, and you will already know about them, have already engaged with them honestly, and will therefore not be devastated by having them named. This is one of the great gifts of self-honesty. It removes the power of the accusation. When a man has looked clearly at himself and accepted what he has seen, there is nothing in that territory that can be used as a weapon against him by someone else. This is the truth at the core of the second part of this document's subject. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others. Not because he becomes invulnerable, he does not. He will still feel pain. He will still experience loss, rejection, disappointment, failure. He will still have days when the weight of being human presses down on him in all the ordinary and extraordinary ways that weight falls on every human being. He is not protected from the world's difficulty. But he is protected from the specific kind of destruction that comes from without, the kind that depends entirely on the presence of something within a man that agrees with the attack. When someone attempts to diminish a person whose self-respect is intact, the attempt does not find purchase. It is not that the man is unaffected by hostility or criticism, he may feel the sting of it, may even take it seriously enough to examine whether there is any truth in it. But the examination is conducted from a position of interior stability rather than interior anxiety. He asks the honest question, is there something real here that I should attend to? If there is, he attends to it, and this itself is a form of self-respect, the willingness to grow. If there is not, if the criticism is unfair, if the attempt to diminish him arises from someone else's pain or agenda or simple cruelty, then he recognizes this and does not absorb it. He allows it to pass without letting it alter his fundamental sense of himself. This is not coldness. This is not the emotional unavailability of someone who has armored themselves against feeling. Quite the opposite, the man with intact self-respect is often more emotionally available than those around him, precisely because he does not need to use his emotional energy to manage constant anxiety about how he is being perceived. He is free to actually feel what he feels, to respond to the world with genuine emotional presence, because his feelings are not being perpetually distorted by the fear of judgment. He cries when he is moved. He laughs when something is genuinely funny. He speaks his care for people directly, without the guardedness of someone who is afraid that direct expression of feeling will be used against him. He can be tender, because his tenderness does not cost him his sense of self. This combination, steadiness and tenderness, groundedness and genuine emotional presence, is not what popular culture typically images when it speaks of the strong, self-respecting man. Popular culture tends to offer two templates: the hard, emotionally inaccessible man who cannot be hurt because he cannot feel, and the endlessly agreeable man who feels everything and responds to everything with the primary goal of maintaining harmony. Neither of these is the thing being described here. The man being described here has done the interior work that allows him to be both present and steady, present enough to feel, steady enough not to be destabilized by feeling. He has integrated what culture typically presents as opposites: strength and sensitivity, firmness and warmth, clarity and compassion. This integration is the fruit of the work of self-respect. It is what becomes possible when a man has spent enough time knowing himself, his actual nature, not the performance, that he can trust himself in the full range of human emotional experience. He is not frightened of his own grief. He is not destabilized by his own desire. He is not ashamed of his own uncertainty. He has met all of these things in the quiet of his own company, and, having met them, he knows that they do not unmake him. They are part of him, and he contains them, they do not contain him. There is something that happens in the world around a man when he reaches this place. It is subtle at first, almost imperceptible. But, over time it becomes unmistakable. People respond to him differently. Not all people, some people, particularly those whose relationship with him was built on the old dynamic, will find the new version of him confusing or uncomfortable. People who benefited from his accommodation will miss it. People who relied on his willingness to absorb blame will find his refusal to do so inconvenient. These responses are informative. They show a man which of his relationships were built on solid ground and which were built on his willingness to make himself small. But those are not the most interesting responses. The most interesting responses come from unexpected directions, from people who previously barely noticed him, who now find themselves drawn to him without quite knowing why. From people who meet him for the first time and immediately sense something reliable in him, something that earns their trust before he has had the opportunity to demonstrate anything particular. From people who are themselves working on the same interior project, the project of becoming more fully themselves, and who recognize in him a fellow traveler and feel the particular warmth of that recognition. And, sometimes, from exactly the kind of person he would most want to be close to. The person who is not looking for someone to manage, not seeking someone to absorb, not drawn to the performance of strength or the promise of endless accommodation, but simply looking for someone real. Someone present. Someone whose yes means yes because their no means no. Someone whose love, if it comes, is given freely rather than administered as a reward for correct behavior. Someone who sees the man as he actually is and chooses him, not despite that, but because of it. This is what self-respect makes possible in the domain of love. Not the guarantee of love, nothing guarantees that. But the conditions in which real love can exist. Because real love, the kind that sustains, that deepens over time, that can hold the weight of actual human life, requires two people who are genuinely present to each other. And genuine presence requires that each person be genuinely themselves. A relationship between two performances is not a relationship. It is a negotiation, a constant management of appearances, a careful dance of mutual illusion that can shatter at any point where reality intrudes too forcefully. The man who has done the work of self-respect comes to love differently. He comes knowing that he does not need to be saved by it. He comes knowing what he brings to it and what he asks of it. He comes prepared to be genuinely known, which is both the greatest gift and the greatest risk that love asks of any person. And, because he is prepared to be known, because he is not hiding behind a performance or a projection, the love that finds him can actually reach him. It does not have to penetrate layers of management and accommodation to get to the real person. The real person is already there, already present, already waiting, not anxiously, not desperately, but with the quiet and open readiness of someone who has learned that they are worth arriving for. This is not a story about perfection. The man at the center of it is not a finished thing. He will continue to make mistakes, to fall into old patterns at moments of high stress or acute fear, to discover new layers of the weak self that had not yet been fully seen. The project of self-knowledge is lifelong, and the man who believes he has completed it has simply found a new form of blindness. What distinguishes him from the man he was at the beginning is not the absence of weakness but his relationship to it, the willingness to see it honestly, to work with it rather than around it, to refuse the comfortable fictions that the weak self offers as alternatives to genuine engagement with himself. He has learned, over the long and uneven course of this interior journey, a few things that seem to hold. He has learned that the impulse to diminish himself in order to earn others' comfort is not kindness but fear, and that distinguishing between the two is among the most important skills a person can develop. He has learned that the discomfort of being honest with himself and with others is always preferable to the long, slow erosion of living inauthentically. He has learned that his needs are not impositions on the world but legitimate expressions of his humanity, and that a person who cannot acknowledge their own needs cannot genuinely meet anyone else's. He has learned that boundaries are not walls but definitions. They do not keep people out, they define the territory within which genuine relationship can exist, and without them there is no genuine relationship, only the performance of one. He has learned, perhaps most importantly, that the love he was so desperately trying to earn through accommodation was never available by that route. The love that is earned through self-erasure is not love for the self, it is love for the performance, for the accommodation, for the convenience. And, when a man changes, when he stops being convenient, stops accommodating things he should not accommodate, stops erasing himself, that love withdraws, revealing that it was never for him in the first place. This is painful. It is among the most painful discoveries in the human experience. But, it is also, ultimately, liberating. Because it clears the space for something real. And, into the space that opens when the false love has withdrawn and the old performances have been retired and the weak self has been examined and laid down, into that space, if a man is patient and honest and willing to remain present with the uncertainty of not knowing what comes next, real things begin to arrive. Real friendship, which requires nothing of him but himself. Real work, which aligns with what he actually values and in which he can engage with genuine investment rather than the hollow productivity of going through motions for other people's approval. Real love, which meets him as he is and chooses him not in spite of his wholeness but because of it. The man who destroys his weak self does not become invincible. He does not become cold or unreachable or above the ordinary human needs for connection and belonging. He becomes, simply, himself, fully, without apology, without the constant management of the gap between who he is and who he pretends to be. And, in becoming himself, he becomes something that no external force can fully undo, because the thing that external forces typically use to undo a person is the person's own complicity, the weak self's agreement with the attack, the interior voice that says, yes, you are right, I am not enough, I deserve this diminishment. Remove that complicity, burn it down through the sustained, difficult, daily work of genuine self-respect, and what remains is something structurally different. A man who knows himself cannot be told who he is by someone who does not know him and wishes him harm. A man who has honestly reckoned with his own failures cannot be destroyed by having them named. A man who has chosen himself, who has looked at what he is, accepted it, committed to improving it, and decided that it is worth his own loyalty, is not available for destruction. He is available for challenge, for growth, for honest engagement with his own imperfection. But destruction requires a structural weakness that has been filled. This is not the end of difficulty. This is not the promise that once a man has built genuine self-respect, life becomes easy or pain becomes rare. What changes is not the world's difficulty but his relationship to it. He stands differently in the face of difficulty, not taller or harder or more impressive, but more rooted, more present, more capable of distinguishing between what requires a response and what simply requires endurance. More able to stay with himself through the experience of loss or failure or rejection rather than fleeing into the old accommodations and self-erasures that once made pain temporarily bearable and permanently prolonged it. He is, in the end, a man who has come home to himself. And home, real home, the interior kind, is not a place that can be taken away by someone else. It was built from the inside. It stands on ground that no one else owns. And, whatever storms come, and they will come, as they come for every human life, he has something to return to when they pass. He has himself. He has the truth of himself, honestly known and honestly held. And, in a world that conspires at every turn to convince people that they are not enough, that they must earn their place, that they must perform and accommodate and diminish themselves to deserve the love and regard of others, the quiet, fierce, daily practice of saying no, I am enough as I am, and I am worth my own loyalty is perhaps the most radical and the most necessary act available to any human being. It is where everything else begins. It is where the right people find you. It is where the right life becomes possible. And it starts, as all genuinely important things start, not with a grand declaration to the world, but with a single honest moment alone with yourself, in which you decide, for perhaps the first time, that you are worth the truth. Self-respect is not something you announce. It is something you build, in silence and, in difficulty, one honest choice at a time. The man who builds it will not need to tell anyone that he has. They will know. And, the ones who matter, the ones worth knowing, will find their way to him, drawn not by the performance but by the presence. Drawn not by what he offers to become for them, but by what he has already, fully, honestly become for himself.